Welcome to my channel. Facts about Apple. Apple was founded on April 1st, 1976 by Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne. The first computer created by Apple, the Apple I, was hand-built by Steve Wozniak and sold for $666.66. The Apple logo with a Y taken out of it is said to be a tribute to Alan Turing, the British mathematician and computer scientist who took a bite of a poisonous apple. Apple's early operations were run out of the Steve Jobs' parents' garage in Los Altos, California. The original code name for the iPhone was Project Purple. The name Macintosh was inspired by an Apple variety, the Macintosh. iTunes was originally developed as a program to manage and organize digital music files for the Macintosh. Apple's first product was the Apple I personal computer kit, which was followed by the Apple II, considered one of the first successful personal computers. iPhones are made at a factory in Zhengzhou, China, often referred to as iPhone City. The idea for the iPod came to Steve Jobs when he was frustrated with the size and capacity of existing music players. The Apple II became popular thanks in part to VisiCalc, the first ever spreadsheet software. Apple's first computer with a graphical user interface was called the Lisa. It was priced at $9,995 in 1983. Apple's first attempt at a personal digital assistant was the Newton Message Pad released in 1993. The original Macintosh development team was known as the Pirates of Silicon Valley. The name iPod was proposed by freelancer copywriter Vinny Chico and is said to be a play on the phrase "Open the pod bay doors," a reference to the film 2001 A Space Odyssey. Apple's fortunes improved significantly after Steve Jobs returned to the company in 1997. The first Apple retail store opened on May 19, 2001 at Tyson's Corner Center in Virginia. The App Store, which revolutionized mobile apps, was launched on July 10, 2008 with 500 apps. Apple acquired the company Siri in 2010, and this technology became the foundation for the virtual assistant Siri. Apple's corporate headquarters is Apple Park, a massive spaceship-like building in Cupertino, California. Apple is committed to renewable energy and has invested in solar and wind projects to power its operations. Apple has held the title of the world's largest publicly traded company by market capitalization and has had enormous cash reserves. Apple has conducted multiple stock splits over the years, which have made its shares more affordable to a wider range of investors. The first mobile developed by Apple was not the iPhone, but a phone with Motorola called the Roku Even, which could play iTunes music. Apple stores are known for their iconic glass store fronts and minimalist open design. Steve Jobs was known for his signature black turtleneck, jeans, and stickers. Apple's early mice, including the Macintosh, had only one button. Early versions of Mass OS had images of a German chocolate cake as placeholder art. An iPhone 4 prototype was famously left in a bar in 2010, resulting in a signature leak before the official announcement. The Apple Macintosh was the first consumer computer to feature a graphical user interface. Steve Jobs founded Next Incorporated after leaving Apple in 1980s. Apple later acquired Next, and this acquisition marked Steve Jobs' return to the company. The company's original logo featured Sir Isaac Newton sitting under an apple tree. Apple has paid out billions of dollars to app developers through the App Store. The I in product names like iPhone, iPad, and iPod originally stood for Internet, as these devices were designed for Internet communication. The iPhone is one of the most popular cameras in the world, used for more photos than any other camera. Apple's first laptop was the Macintosh Portable, released in 1989. It weighed 15.8 pounds. Apple's core values are simplicity, the removal of complexity, and a focus on user experience. The Apple II series of computers sold over 6 million units and was produced for nearly 2 decades. The first iMac introduced USB ports to the mass market, helping to accelerate the adoption of the USB standards. The iTunes Store catalog includes millions of songs, but at its peak, an iTunes library could hold 90,000 songs. Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple, has the number plate UCSB001 on his car, referring his time at UC Berkeley. The Apple II was a popular gaming platform with thousands of games developed for it. The first Apple store located in Tysons Corner, Virginia, generated $599 in sales on its opening day. Steve Wozniak built a device that allowed him to make free long-distance phone calls, which he used to prank call the Pope. The Lisa computer was named after Steve Jobs' daughter, while the Macintosh was named after an Apple variety. The codenames for the projects were Lisa and Macintosh, respectively. Apple's first inventor, Mike Markula, wrote a business plan for the company and provided an initial investment of $50,000. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.